My name is Rodler Frederick Morris Sr. I go by Rick, and my title is President of Morris, Nelson and Associates, LLC in Leavenworth, Kansas. The main threads of interest in my life are the military and history. And both of these threads are rooted upon reflection in the fact that my grandfather served in World War I and my father in World War II, and my grandmother Morris actually served in the Army in Panama during the First World War. Discussions of those great historical events sort of surrounded me from the time I was a small boy. I read widely in history, also in other fields, science and literature, as a boy, and then had the good fortune to go to Delbarton High School in New Jersey, where I was taught by Benedictine monks who remain the standard of excellence for me in matters intellectual, ethical, and spiritual to the present day. The fact that both my granddad and dad fought against Germany pointed me in the direction of modern European history with a focus on Germany. But I ought to note that my interest early on were kind of deep and broad. So I've had an intense interest in putting modern Europe in the context of Western civilization from ancient times through the early modern period. And for that matter, I've been intensely interested both in formal study and in reading in fields like intellectual history, history of science and technology, obviously military history. And increasingly I've tended to look at these fields in the broad context of world history. Very interested too in an emerging field now that's called big history, which puts human history in the context of natural history and the history of the overall context in which human activities fit. At the University of North Carolina, where I did my MA and PhD, I specialized in modern Europe, although much of my PhD exams also included early modern Europe. And of course, the area in which I do deep research and have done publication is modern Germany, especially the rise and fall of the Third Reich and the post-war period. My father had actually participated in the occupation of Germany for a time. The past is worthy of study in its own right. It is in many ways, when we study the past, we're strangers in a strange land, and a strange land that we cannot observe directly. We've got to understand it through the relics that the past leaves behind. Doing so is immensely rewarding. It much expands our experience of people, our experience of cultures, our experience of contexts that are quite different from the one that we are normally set in. In this sense, it's very much like travel. Studying the past is like travel in the present. Now, having said that, the study of history is immensely relevant to, in my judgment, to solving problems in the present. And in every case when I do so, I both study the background using historical methods of the problem as I framed the problem as the first step towards working towards a solution. And I also tap into the resemblance between history and design and systems thinking. Morris Nelson and Associates enables clients to master complexity through innovation. It is co-founded, I co-founded it with my dear friend John Nelson, whose knowledge and skills overlap with mine, but we are highly complementary. My background is in history, his background is in engineering and operations research and systems analysis. My skill is in understanding words, his skill in the hard quantitative side of analysis. Our associates, our co-partners are Dave Nichols and Maria Minshew, and all three of them are retired field grade officers. So there is a kind of Army and military perspective, especially given that I'm a retired Army civil servant. We prefer clients who are dealing, whose own mission is to serve broad segments of the public, partners, serve clients like law enforcement, the military, folks who are networked together to counter human trafficking and to find ways to heal the victims, and others whose impact on the world in which we live is likely to be fundamental. We have a pretty intense commitment to having a social impact that often overrides the desire to make money. I lead M&A and innovation, counter human trafficking and digital transformation, and I have a key interest in the new world that is emerging, revolving around artificial intelligence, and a special interest in how these new and emerging digital trends are useful in terms of countering complex and adaptive thinking threats and complex and otherwise perhaps intractable problems. Justice Yu is the child of Ashley Chapman, and my work in supporting counter human trafficking is rooted in the courses she put together revolving around the freedom strategy that are the forerunner of Justice University. Justice University's framing of the way ahead in serving those who've been victimized by sex trafficking is the starting point back in 2018 that has continued with a vengeance to the present day of my learning how to counter human trafficking, weaving that learning together with what I already knew about counter drug trafficking and countering terrorist and insurgent threats, and deepening it to understand what needs to be done in order to engage in successfully the long-term healing of victims of sex trafficking. It is an evolving discipline that fortunately is rapidly evolving now from seeds that were set in the late 1990s and early 20th century, kind of wrapped together by Ashley Chapman in a synthesis, and which are now widely blooming in order to provide real solutions to healing the victims of sex trafficking while simultaneously working to dismantle the trafficking businesses and to deter and stop buyers, since a holistic approach is required, a systems of system approach to this particular complex problem. Since 1991, I've shifted my focus from historical problems to problems that involve bringing about change in the present in order to achieve better future states. To bring about change that is desirable and feasible and viable. And so there needs to be situational awareness of how events in the past, present, and those you project in the future, anticipate for the future, are connected, because only in that way can you really understand how to bring about an idea that seems likely to yield benefits in the future, bring it about to an achieved future state. My plans for the future involve a kind of a phase sequence of developments achieving several goals. My immediate plan for the future is to help the emerging network of organizations in the Kansas City metro as they put into place an effective, holistic approach to stopping sex trafficking and healing its victims. So that's my first goal. I have a kind of a final mission, as it were, and in that I bring my own particular expertise and capacity building, and with my partners we bring a pretty deep knowledge based on transnational organized crime networks and counterterrorism in a discipline that's called counter-threat network. So the big problem is getting this funded. So you've got to be able to articulate your needs while capacity building in ways that can be understood and measured, so that you can bring to bear the relevant resources. My goal too is to then shift my focus. I'm 76 years old, so times I can hear time's winged chariot. And as I mentioned, a major thing in every professional's life should be an effective work-life balance, and that's not something that I can say that I really achieved. The good news is I've had some signal accomplishments, and the bad news is that my wife Debbie and all my children and grandchildren had to pay for it. So I want to shift before I turn 80, away from consulting and serving clients and practical engagement to a focus on family, especially a focus on my wife Debbie, because she is the anchor of my life, and then a focus on children and these precious grandchildren. I've had 3 different careers in one. I've been a historian at both a research university and a teaching college, and succeeded in becoming a tenured associate professor with publications and tremendous rewards in serving students. I've been a civil servant, and I've had the privilege of being a businessman who has collaborated in 2 successful startups and who served as a chief knowledge officer in a Fortune 500 company. And in all of those lives, I've had opportunities to make changes, small and big. The single most important one, though, was one in mid-career and at near the start of my civil service career, when I had the challenge of dealing with all that we had learned and all the documentation that we had acquired and all the requirements for learning new lessons that came out of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in the first Gulf War. It was in response to that requirement that I built, with tremendous collaborative efforts, a project that was highly decorated, including by the Vice President and by the Smithsonian Institution, that is called the Army Knowledge Network System. This system, also called the Automated Historical Archive System and later the Call Database, became part of a family of systems that leveraged past and current experience in order to develop insights that would lead to effective changes in behavior in the future in the military. There was one other very big thing that I learned from developing and implementing the Army Knowledge Network System, and that was the absolute requirement to collaborate and to partner, to work together in high-performance teams, and to network with others as deeply and broadly as possible. We now live in a world that is affected by a kind of a paradox. It's a world that's radically local, and on the other hand, that is increasingly global, and one where what happens in a particular locality to a particular individual, team, organization, network is tied in to complex global events and trends and systems. And it's a world where a set of complex problems emerge that require really understanding complexity, bringing to bear the disciplines that are designed to leverage complexity for significant results in the future. It is critical to our ability to both put into place the best world for the present and to avoid the kind of sub-optimization that undermines our good intentions. I ought to note that my career began with the heartache in the broad event of the Vietnam War. 2 of my roommates and many of my friends were killed in action in that war. And in some ways, although I did not serve over in Vietnam. I served in the Army at that time. That event perhaps stamped my commitment to be relevant in the future, and especially since if I'm lucky enough to see my fallen comrades in the future, or I hope that what I've done since they died and gave up everything they had or whatever be has been worthy of their sacrifice.